talking about our program today, Red Tails and Liberators. I'm very excited to have Jerry Whiting back with us. This is our second go-around doing one of these presentations. Thank you, Jerry, for coming down. Jerry drove down from the Bay Area to be with us. Thank you. Thank you so much. Let me tell you a little bit about Jerry Whiting. He's a native of South Dakota. He graduated at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he got his bachelor's degree and later earned his master's at John F. Kennedy University. And he went on to spend 28 years in law enforcement. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you for that service. Now, he's going on. He's written 3 books in the areas of World War II. You can see he has books with him here today. You'll want to make sure to get a signed copy. One of his books, I'm Off to War, Mother, but I'll Be Back, Reflections on a World War II Tail Gunner. This is the biography of his father's combat experience in B-24s, and we're going to hear much more about that today. So I want to thank him for his good work. He's also produced documentaries, the most recent one having much to do with our topic again today, the Tuskegee Airmen, and this exciting, interesting, captivating event that took place in Ramitelli. So Jerry, why don't you come on up and tell us about it?
And I'll tell you a little bit how I got involved with this story. And a lot of times, you know, we hear stories that aren't too good. Last year, I talked about the murder of a Tuskegee Airman. I'd investigated that and learned that this guy was murdered after he'd been shot down. This is a different type of story. And this is a 3-generation story. It's about my family. And I kind of take, it was so personal to me because when I first heard the story, I heard it from my dad, who was a tail gunner, and he, like most World War II veterans, he didn't talk much about the war unless it had a real moral to the story, and it was usually during a discipline situation, or if it was something that was not really combat related. And he told me as a little boy about these guys called the Red Tails. He said they were this all-black fighter group, and we got a chance to visit them, and it was one of the best experiences of my life. It was a break from combat, and so he told me about that repeatedly. And as I grew up, he continued to tell the story, and after the movie The Tuskegee Airmen came out, he went to different things where the Tuskegee Airmen group was there, but he never found any of the Red Tails. And when that movie, The Tuskegee Airmen, came out, he goes, no, that was about some different guys. These guys were the Red Tails. So he didn't put it together right away. But eventually he did, but he never got to meet and thank any of these guys. So I'll tell you more about that in a couple minutes. But what I'm going to talk about is the original incident, what happened, kind of the follow-up to it, how I got involved with Lucasfilm, and to bring the story more forward, and with some other people, to thank the Red Tails for what they've done. And so it's going to be a 3-generation story, basically of me, being the 2nd generation of my brother and my sister, my dad being the one who experienced it, and then my niece, the 3rd generation, and how she became part of the story too. So without further ado, I'm going to start out with something that's more about the end of the story.
Hello, I'm Tom Brokaw, NBC News in New York, and I want to take just a moment out of your happy reunion time to pay tribute to this getting together of the Red Tails and the 485th Bomb Group. This is a great tribute to one of the most important moments in American history, and that is, A, the winning of World War II, which saved the world and gave us the country that we have today, but also the fact that we did it together, whatever the color of our skin, whatever our station in life, at home and abroad, in the skies and on the ground. We worked together as one. As Danny Inouye, the senator from Hawaii who lost an arm in combat, earned the Medal of Honor, said, it was a time in America when we were one fist, as he likes to describe it. You were one fist in another way. You were in the skies, African-American aviators and white bombers, bombardiers, pilots, gunners. You were working together. You were looking out for one another. That's the essence of the American way. So to all of you, the emblematic members of the greatest generation, I salute you, and I wish you the very best.
That was something that Tom Brokaw did for us when we had our reunion. He didn't do it for NBC, he did it for us. And I think part of the reason he did it was my connection to South Dakota, because he's from South Dakota. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I never got a chance to meet him. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but the stuff that I produced about it, the book, I'm Off to War, Mother, but I'll be back. I started writing that book when we knew my dad wasn't going to be with us anymore. My mom talked to me and she said, he'll talk about the war now. Maybe you better get this stuff down before we lose him, since he's open to talk about it. And I think part of it was he realized his mortality, you know, and if he didn't talk about it, and it never intended to be a book, but it just kept growing and got out of hand. And then much later, when I decided that I wanted to get these guys together, long after he was gone, I decided to produce a documentary, and I have no experience in this, but my attitude was the message is so important, and the message is so important, so much more important than the messenger, that I'm going to do it anyway. So that's what I did. And I'll tell you a little bit about the mission where the bombers were on that day. It was December 29th, 1944. The 45th Bomb Group, which was my dad's group, which they later made me the historian for the association, they were based in Venosa, Italy, which is halfway between Bari, roughly halfway between there and Naples, right in the center. And the target was the marshalling yard, the rail yard in Verona, Italy. And there were 27 aircraft that were going to bomb them. And they were part of a larger formation, but in the terrible weather, they got separated. So the 45th Bomb Group bombed alone. They had no fighter escort because it was a short mission, and they didn't feel they needed. There's one loss that day, which was a tragic loss as they were heading up over the Adriatic Sea. My dad and some of the other guys saw what looked like a sack of flour fall out of a plane, and it was a bombardier on another plane who'd actually stepped on the nose wheel door and fallen through it, lost his life that way. The weather was so bad on their return as they came down the Adriatic Sea. When they got to the spur of Italy, their group commander had taken off from the base, managed to get off in a B-25, and met the formation out there and said, guys, don't even try. You can't make it. We're snowed in. Don't try to make it. You can't, for a friendly field anywhere you can. The fighter fields are along the coast. They're not snowed in. If you can get through the muck, that's where you got to go. And so the formation separated, and 17 B-24s spotted the field that was Ramitelli, Italy, the home of the Red Tails. And most of the guys didn't know that it was a Red Tails field. They just saw this airfield, and there were a bunch of them along the coastline of the American fighters, P-51 and P-38 fields. And so when they saw the field, the lead plane said, we got to get down. And so that's what happened. They landed nose to tail. The fighter field was short, and I later talked to Ted Lumpkin, who's been to this museum in the past, and he recently passed away. And he told me he was at the end of the field. He was one of the intelligence officer for the Red Tails. And he said he was just happened to be at the end of the field, and he heard this noise of an airplane coming in. And he said it wasn't our P-51, it was louder. And he said it just came screaming down out of the fog to the runway. And he said almost as soon as it touched down, he heard another loud noise. And he said, here comes another B-24, another B-24. He said they were coming B-24 after B-24, and he said, we never had that many planes land there. Occasionally a plane would come in with supplies or damaged and needed help. But to see all these, he said, it seemed like there were 100. and they landed, and he said our field was short and the taxiways were narrow, so he said as soon as they could get down, they get to the end of the field and they just stopped there. And then the other one would be in behind him. He said there wasn't room to turn around. So that's sort of what happened. A few of the planes were damaged. There were a couple very minor wounds, but anybody with major wounds would have gone to a different base where there was a hospital. I want to talk a little bit about an earlier mission. There's kind of an idea out there that the bomber guys didn't know who the Red Tails were. And I'm sure that was the case sometimes, but not always. Some of the guys knew full well. And there was an earlier mission on November 17th with the same bomb group when they went to a place called Blackhammer, Germany. It was the farthest they'd ever flown. And if anything happened, they weren't going to make it home because it was so far from their base. Blackhammer, Germany is actually in Poland now. So it was a long mission. And my dad had told me a story about how when they were separated, the plane suddenly went into a dive, left the formation. And from talking to him and his co-pilot, I learned that the reason the plane went into a dive, pilot lost consciousness. And apparently, I don't know if the oxygen system for the pilot was shot out or it malfunctioned, but the pilot was slumped over. The co-pilot had the presence of mind to realize we got to get to a lower altitude, so he dived the plane. And when they got down to a lower altitude, again, they were alone. They were a straggler. And at that point, they were over Czechoslovakia, probably. And they had a long ways back to Italy as a straggler. And not a good situation because the German fighters at that stage of the war primarily picked on the stragglers, the planes that needed help. And I heard it from the co-pilot more about what happened there down, and it's like all the guys are, oh man, we're in bad trouble now. Everybody keep your eyes open. And the co-pilot told me that the flight engineer tapped him on the shoulder. The co-pilot's still flying the plane, the pilot's not in good shape. The flight engineer had come forward to see what happened and pointed out the window. The co-pilot looks out the window, and here comes this Mustang coming down to their level, trying to slow down. And he doesn't point his nose at him. You don't point your nose at a B-24 because you get shot down. Or there's a chance of that. So this lone P-51 comes down and comes up alongside the co-pilots, and the co-pilot said that the guys loosened his oxygen mask because he was at a lower altitude where he didn't need it, and he said he saw this black smiling face at him, and the guy made some sort of a sign towards him, acknowledging him, and then went up. I think he gave him a thumbs up, like I'm going to be above you, and escorted him all the way back to where they were safe, Adriatic Sea. So they knew who the Red Tails were. Let me see here. That's just a shot of another plane, a P-51, escorting a lone B-24. This is a Red Tail P-51 that one of the 45th bomber guys snapped this photo as a plane came up alongside him. On that November 17th mission, I tried to find who the escort was that day. I tried to identify that pilot because I wanted to thank him or thank his family. A lot of times they kept no records of that because that was their job. It was so routine that they just did it. They didn't think anything about it, but this B-24 crew sure did. And so I could never find out who it was, but then I realized when researching all the records that the Red Tails weren't escorting that bomb group that day. They were escorting a B-17 group to somewhere in Czechoslovakia. So when I talked to Bob Friend about it and a couple of the other Red Tails, I said, there's no record, and it said you weren't escorting. He goes, hey, we escorted anybody that needed help. And on some of those missions, you'd come across a damaged plane from a different group. We didn't care what group they were in. We were going to do what we could to bring them back home. And I'm sure that's what happened that day. That's my dad's crew there. My dad's in the, where that blue arrow is on the top. Again, I said it's a 3-generation story. If you want to include his mother, it's a 4-generation story. That's the route that they took on that mission. There, you can see where Venosa is, and they went along the coastline out to the Adriatic Sea to bomb Verona. And Ramitelli was right along the coastline, as were a bunch of U.S. fighter bases. 17 of them landed at Ramitelli, and the other 10 found other fields somewhere. But again, it was so thick, the fog was so thick, the weather was so bad, that a lot of them just got separated and looked for anywhere. But amazingly, all of them found a field to land at. One of them crash landed and destroyed the plane, but the crew was safe. That's a picture of Colonel Tom Haig. He was the guy that went up in the B-25 and said, guys, you're not coming home today. There's no way you can make it. We got more than a foot of snow on our airfield, so find somewhere to land. This is the elite pilot who landed there, and I'm going to include what some of these guys said about it when I interviewed them or when I found records. You know, and he said, we were treated royally there. Major Pruitt, the squadron commander, felt very good about being there. Maybe it was due to Pruitt's rank, but we were given a Quonset hut as sleeping quarters. The officers stayed with the other officers, and the enlisted men stayed with the ground personnel, primarily mechanics. So when I wanted to bring this story forward later and thank the Red Tails, I wanted to make sure that the ground personnel got their due credit. There were a lot more airmen who were enlisted men that were there than officers, and they stayed, with enlisted men. This is Art Kane. He was the nose gunner on one of the planes, and he talked about how great the food was and how great a time he had. And they brought him cinnamon rolls with raisins and coffee in the tent we shared with mechanics. I was surprised at how educated the mechanics were. All had some college. And today we might look at that as a racial thing, that, these black guys had been to college. But I really, in talking with these guys, I don't think it was that. It's that a lot of these gunners had virtually no education at all. Many of them had never been to high school. And that was the primary reason, I think, why they were impressed is, geez, these guys are really, some have been to college, and they lacked education. This is a bombardier who talked about what a great time he had and how he stayed in a tent with 2 different pilots, and his crew talked about their visit for months. And that co-pilot came back early to lighten the planes, so because it was such a short field, and the base was running out of provisions. I mean, all of a sudden to have 170 guys you weren't expecting living there, eating 3 meals, it really taxed what was going on there. So they sent some of the non-essential flying personnel back by truck, and they went back on, most of them went back on New Year's Eve. But John Strang told me, he said he was always kind of upset because the guys on his crew were bragging about what a great New Year's Eve party he missed and how Colonel Davis had brought out the best booze he had, and all they had was gin and orange juice back at their own base. So he was envious of the guys who got to stay. He also, when he got out of his plane, when they first landed, John Strang told me that he said, I stayed with the plane while some of the crew went out looking for what are we going to do here? Are we going to find, we can't go anywhere, trying to meet with somebody to tell them where they could stay. He stayed with the plane, and he said this mechanic came up and was admiring their plane, one of the red-tailed mechanics, he was admiring the plane and the note card. He said, "Nudist K, gee, that's a nude woman on the plane. You're allowed to do that?" Colonel Davis never would have allowed anything like that. And I don't have a picture of Leland Larson, but his statement was included in a newsletter at the base later, and it tells you the situation. "We're treated like kings. Every one of the men was wonderful to us, and the quartermaster immediately sent to another field for food and 5 blankets apiece. We remained in the private tents with the men, and sleeping quarters were ideal. They insisted on serving us breakfast in bed and provided us with beer, PX rations, their own, cakes, Cokes, writing paper, and whiskey, and the New Year's Day dinner they served us was out of this world." Gerald Morris was from Georgia. His nose gunner was Art Kane, and he said, "I kind of wondered about this Georgia pilot we had, you know, a Southern guy here at Ramitelli. What was he going to say about it?" And he wrote a letter to his wife saying, "I stayed with a flight commander from Thomasville, Georgia. He's a fine fellow and did everything possible to make my stay more comfortable." This is one of my favorites. This is Jim Scheib, my dad's co-pilot. He wrote a letter once he got back, and I'll tell you more about it in a minute. But in this letter, he said, "They treated us like kings. I slept with a pilot from Kansas City, and he couldn't do enough for me. He shared his PX rations with me and wouldn't let me get gas for his stove or water, etc." And this man clearly talked about it being a life-changing experience for him, and I'll show you a video clip a little later about, he was from Pittsburgh and grew up, you know, in a neighborhood that had some older brothers that were having some problems with, you know, the blacks in the neighborhood or in a few streets away. And he talked to me, and I put it more in my documentary when I interviewed him about how he just described it as a completely life-changing experience being there, and that surprised me. I didn't realize it had that big of an impact on him. Harold Kempfer was another guy, a ball turret gunner. He talked about how short the runway was, so the bombers had to park, you know, at the edge of the runway or side of the runway. They ran out of tents with the enlisted men, so he slept at his crew. The enlisted men slept in the enlisted men's club on tables and benches after the club was closed. They treated us well, and they're great flyers. That's my dad there. And he wrote a letter home to his mother, and here's what he said: "I stayed in a tent with Negro mechanics. They treated us very nice, and all of them were very educated." Again, the education thing. My dad was a farm kid from South Dakota. As far as he got was 8th grade, because there weren't any schools. You can't go to school if there's no school around. There was no high school. We had a big time listening to their stories. One thing he told me that he didn't write was he stayed with some mechanics who were very excellent musicians. My dad always loved music. And he talked about what great musicians these guys were and how much fun they had. And he went home early. He had to leave early and go home on a truck. And I think one of the reasons, aside from the treatment, was that they were out of combat. They were out of combat for a few days, and they'd been flying some of these long missions, and they had some fairly heavy losses, and they were just exhausted from flying combat. There was another plane that landed there from a different group, from the 455th group. And when I came across this photo, I knew it wasn't a 485th plane, but it turns out this is a plane that was from this one other bomb group that was there called Balls of Fire, and that shows some of the red tail mechanics with the plane. And what did the Red Tails say about it? Did they think it was a good experience? This is what Colonel B.O. Davis, commanding officer, said. Such a mixing of races would never have been allowed to occur in the United States. I provided a case of Johnny Walker for our New Year's Eve party. Our bomber friends were still weathered in and took communion with us at the Sunday service. Some of the other bomber guys mentioned going to church with the Red Tails. And this theme keeps coming up about segregation and the mixing of races not being allowed in the United States at the time, which, you know, we know it was segregated. Ted Lumpkin, I referenced him before because he was the intelligence officer and actually described the plane's landing. And he said it was a signature event during the war, particularly for the white bomber crews. The bomber crews got to know the personnel of the 332nd fighters that were escorting them to the targets. Were piloted by black pilots, and the entire organization supporting them were also black. It represented the true racial integration of American troops. It happened overseas and probably couldn't have happened in the continental U.S. at the time. Same thing that Colonel Davis said. And, you know, Tom Brokaw and NBC in their reports kind of said it was the first integration in the U.S. military. I wouldn't say it was such because it was a temporary thing. You know, it happened one time, but it certainly set the stage for things to come. And Bob Friend, you know, Bunny out here, that was a plane, you know, named after that he flew. When I interviewed him for Lucasfilm, and I'll explain that a little later, Lucasfilm had me interview a bunch of these Red Tails. And I knew nothing about Bob. I don't like to do an interview like when I was a cop. I want to know about that person before I go into interview so I can do a better interview. And all I knew was that he was a pilot. And I sat down with him, and Lucasfilm had a couple cameras running. And before they started him, I just introduced myself, told him who I was. And the first thing he said to me off camera was, "You're not going to make this about race, are you?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He goes, "This was not about race. This was about Americans taking care of each other." And I thought, wow, it almost stopped me, you know, because I didn't expect him to have it that way. But Bob, very easygoing, nice man, smiling all the time. But if he wanted to make a point, he would make it. And I got to know him much better later on. That shows the condition of the airfield that day, back at Venosa, during that time period, and why no bombers could land there. Another plane. Just terrible conditions, but along the coast, you know, it was a little bit warmer, and they didn't have that snow. Here's Jim Scheib again. And again, he's my dad's co-pilot. He's still alive, still sharp, just a really kind of matter-of-fact man. And when the planes went to leave that day, my dad told me that, he said, the guys that stayed, I heard when they all returned that a letter was left in every plane. And I said, "What do you mean, Dad?" And this is when I was going to write my book. He said, "Well, the Red Tails left a letter thanking the bomber guys for coming." I go, "Really?" I said, "Did you see it?" He goes, "I can't remember, but I know there was a letter left in the plane." So I was interested in what the letter said. So I called the pilot, and he told me, he said, "I remember that. There was no letter in the plane." Called another crew member still alive, the ball turret gunner. And he said, "Yeah, I think there was a letter in the plane." So now I got the pilot saying definitely no, my dad saying, yeah, there's a letter, but I didn't see it. So I called Jim Shive, and he said, yeah, there's a letter in the plane. I said, do you know what it said? And he goes, yeah, I was thinking about that letter because I knew we were going to talk. I said, do you know what the letter, you do know what the letter said? And he goes, yeah, you want to know? And he started telling me, I said, Jim, it's like you're reading the letter. He said, I am. I said, you don't have it. You don't have that original letter. And he said, yeah, I kept it. And I said, why would you have kept that letter? And he said, because it meant so much to me. He said, when I got home, when I got back to our home base, he said, I just knew that this letter was so important. And he said, you know, who knows what's going to happen to me and our crew when we fly more combat. He said, I didn't want that letter to get lost, so I sent it home to my mother. So that's how it survived. This is the original letter, and I'll just read it because I think I get emotional time I read it, or every time I see it. To the visiting pilots and crews, you've been the guests of the 332nd All-Negro Fighter Group. We hope that our facilities, such as they are, were suitable and adequate enough to have made your stay here a pleasant one. On behalf of Colonel Davis and the command, I extend to you our most hearty wishes for a happy new year and many happier landings. You're welcome to return here at any time, and I'm sure that we can make your stay an enjoyable one. The pilots of this command have expressed their desires to have made clear that it's a pleasure to be able to protect you and look after your well-being, both in the air and here on the ground. Remember when you were up there and see the red-tailed Mustangs in the sky? They're your friends of the 332nd Fighter Group. Pardon me. Here's hoping for a quick ending of the war and a better and more peaceful world. Many happy landings. Eugene Weaver, Captain Air Corps Public Relations Officer. And that's a picture of Captain Weaver. And when I interviewed some of these, the Red Tails, they said, you know, nobody ever thanked us for this before. We're glad to get the attention now, but, you know, well, what I found was that wasn't exactly the case, but again, it was war. You know, people aren't dwelling on things. They got a war to fight. But the 45th Commander, pardon me, the 45th Commander did send a letter, 2 letters. I never found the other one. He sent one to Colonel Davis, but he also sent a letter to Major Jones, who was in charge of the ground mechanics. And what he said was, Dear Major Jones, on behalf of the officers and enlisted men of the 45th Bombardment Group, I want to personally thank you for the courtesy and assistance which you and the personnel of the 366th Air Service Squadron so splendidly offered to our crews which landed at your base on 29 December 1944. I fully realize what an inconvenience this forced landing must have made on your facilities, and the remarkable manner in which you, the people of the 15th Fighter Command, rose to the situation is all the more commendable. The very able assistance which your service squadron has given to the 332nd is well known, and now you've proven yourself just as capable in servicing our bombers. Well, you kind of wonder what happened afterwards. Did these guys ever run into each other? And one of the things that happened was this guy named Art Kane, this nose gunner, told me that he was concerned when they arrived. He said, we had 2 or 3 Southern guys on our crew, and he said, you could see, they didn't say anything, but they weren't particularly happy to be there. You know, it was a new experience. He said, I was just happy to be on the ground, anywhere, alive. But he said, some of these guys, you know, because they were Southerners, he said it was more questionable. So we were staying with these tents, these men in their tents, these mechanics. And that evening they said, why don't you go out to the enlisted men's club with us, we'll have a few beers. And they said, we don't have any money, we can't go. They didn't fly with money. And so the guys, the red tail mechanic said, no, come on with us, we'll buy your drink, don't worry about it. He said, you never saw people change their attitude so quickly as after having a few beers. And he said it was like they were the best of friends after that. And he said but that continued throughout the stay. And he said I was really surprised that happened, because these guys, they were from the deep south, but he said no, they were just as happy as I was. And he said the next day we broke into the money out of our emergency flight kits in case we were shot down, and we were given some money so we could reciprocate. He also said that when they returned, they'd gone to a movie, and he said they were sitting on these planks, and he said we had bomb fin casings because we were bomber crews, and the bomb fin casing made really nice stools to sit on. So he said when we flew back to our base at Venosa and the weather got a little bit better, our pilot and a couple of us loaded up our Bombay with all these bomb fin casings and took them back to Ramitelli so that they could have some decent seating in their movie theater. He also told me that he came back by ship with a bunch of 15th Air Force people. The ship was just packed, he said. And he said, be darned if he didn't see one of the red tail mechanics who was on the ship with him. And I said, he was on the same ship? He goes, yeah. And he said, I saw him, I went up to him, and he recognized me, and he said, we stayed with him for several days in their tent. And he said, did you get paid yet? Art said, yeah, I got paid. He goes, yeah, we're still waiting. Our pay's, since we're on the ship, we didn't get paid. And he goes, why are you asking? He goes, oh, there's a poker game. And he said, I'd like to get in the poker game. And he goes, hey, I'll loan you some money. He goes, no, I hate to borrow money. No, I'll loan you money. So he gave him $10. He said a few hours later, the guy came back and he had dollar bills hanging out of his pockets. He'd won big. And he said, hey, I'm going to split it with you. And he goes, no, you're not going to split. I just want my $10. That was the deal. No, I want to give you half. And he wouldn't take it. Well, after the war ended, he came back home to where he lived in Washington State. And he'd gotten to know these guys for a few days fairly well. And they talked about where they were from. He gets a call from a local clothing store. And the guy said, hey, I need you to come and get fitted for your suit. And he goes, I didn't order any suit. And he goes, well, why don't you come down here and I'll talk to you about it. So he goes down there not knowing what's up. And he gets down there and goes, hey, I didn't order any suit. I'm not going to pay for any suit because I did. And he goes, no, it's paid for. And he goes, what do you mean? He said, well, this black guy came in and gave me your name and address and left a bunch of money and said, I want to buy him a suit. I want to buy this guy a suit. Could you find him and have him come in? And he said, I know. Who else could it have been? It had to have been the guy that I loaned the money to. So, other than that, I didn't hear of any follow-up friendships. Aren't they cute? I decided I wanted to get the group together. I wanted to thank the Red Tails, the ones who are at Ramitelli. As I was thinking about this, I got a call from a woman named Zelly Orr. She was the national historian for Tuskegee Airmen, and she goes, do you know anything about a bunch of bomber guys landing at Ramitelli at the end of December? I go, yeah, I do. And she goes, well, how do you know about it? I said, well, my dad was one of those guys, and he told me about it. And she goes, well, somebody said you had more information. And I said, well, do you have my book? And she goes, no. I said, well, I wrote a book about my dad, and in it there's a chapter about his visit there. And she goes, well, how come I don't know about that? I said, I don't know. I sent it to a copy of the book to a previous historian, and there didn't seem to be a lot of interest, and I was a little bit disappointed, because I thought it was such a nice story. And she goes, well, I'm interested. have you ever thought about getting them together? And I go, yeah. And she said, do you have any money for it? And I go, no. And she says, neither do I, but you know, if we don't do it, it's not going to happen with their advancing ages. So I decided to do it and put this reunion together. And I said, can you find some red tails? I don't want just red tails. I want ones who opened up their tents, who were there at that time. You know, because people come and go from groups. And I said, I want to specifically thank those people who were there at that time. She said, I'll find some. So she began searching. And I got to thinking, if we're going to do this at our bond group reunion, we ought to have a documentary for it. Something to thank the red tails, but also for all the guys. And I thought maybe I should put it together. I mean, there's nobody else to do it. So I started working on it, got a friend from Minnesota to interview one of the guys, and I interviewed the co-pilot from my dad's crew and started to put it together. And I was having a hard time. So about that time, my niece moves in with us. She was from, been working up in Oregon and got a job in San Francisco. I live about 30 miles from San Francisco. So I told her, I said, you know, rent's expensive over there. You don't know if this new job is going to work out. So why don't you stay with us and save your money? It won't cost anything to stay here. So she moved in. That's her on the right there, the blonde. And so I was working on this thing, and she was there, and I started to tell her, you know, I'm making this documentary, and I said, didn't you take some film classes in college? And she goes, yeah, an editing class. I said, well, good, you're going to edit my film. And she goes, you don't know how to make a film. And I go, I know, that's why you're going to help me. And so she said, just let me watch it, what you've done. So she watched it, and she was kind of emotional. And when she got done and she came out, she said something, well, I said, is it that bad, you know? And she goes, well, you need some help with it. And I go, I know, but, you know, she said, well, I like this story. And I think at that point she asked like where I got the story. And I said, well, or something like that. And I said, well, it's your grandfather's story. And she said, I never heard that. I said, yeah. And she said, I never heard it. And I said, well, that's probably because you never read the book that I gave you about him. And I think she said, well, I don't read much. But I remember her telling me that she wanted to tell her friends at work about it. And 3 days later, I got a call from Amy Miller, the gal on the left. My niece had gone to work for Lucasfilm. And I wasn't trying to get any attention or anything for it. I just got her to help me. Well, she told people at Lucas, and they completed their film, The Red Tails, but it hadn't been released. So Amy called me and said, can we come? We heard this marvelous story. And I said, well, you know, I need to tell you something. This isn't a media story. It's too important for that. This is about the men. And she said, well, we'd sure like to do interviews if you're having a banquet. And I said, no interviews that night. Nobody's going to hang a microphone in front of my vets on a night that's really important. It's not a media thing if you won't, you know. And I said, another thing that you need to understand, I know that you're from Lucasfilm, and the film Red Tails is about some pretty special guys, you know, the black fighter pilots and the crews and the rest of the men at their base. But I said, you need to understand up front that this isn't a black story. And it's also not a white story. It's a black and white story, how things should be. And I just don't want the story to get spun. I know a lot of things aren't positive, but this story is a positive story. And I think, I just don't want anybody to spin that story because it dishonors everybody that was there. And I said another thing is no interviews, you know, that night. I mentioned that earlier. And she said, well, we'd like to interview that night. And I said, you can't. I said, why do you want to come? And she said, because I want to be in the same room with all of them. That was the right answer. And I said, fine, if you meet. She said, well, I'll talk to some people here at Lucas and we'll get back to you. And she got back to me a couple days later, and I said, what did she say? And what did they say? And she goes, kind of the same thing I said, that people don't usually tell Lucasfilm what to do. You know, and I said, well, that's the way it is. You know, this is for our vets. And I'm not going to let anybody get in the way of honoring our vets by them being together. They've never been together before since the war. And I don't want anybody putting microphones in front of them that night. It's their night to be together. So she said, we're in. She said that, you know, other people said too that so we don't usually have people telling us what we can or can't do, but, you know, we embrace it. So they were in. And as things move forward, I had to throw that picture in. That's me with my niece. You know, back in the kind of early days, and that's when she was staying with us. That's the reunion. The men at the reunion. But before the reunion, I'd had inquiries from different newspapers, people wanting to come, and I just kind of said no. Because, I mean, it was like they were pushy with me, and it doesn't go over real well. I'm a real easygoing guy until you kind of push me too far. And so I just said, no, this isn't a media event. Lucasfilm is going to be there. But what happened was Lucasfilm said, if there's anybody that you'd like us to share our footage with, let us know. You know, we'll be happy to share. And so I said, okay. So the day before I left for the reunion, which was in San Diego, I got a call. And this woman said she was with NBC in Burbank and wanted to, you know, and I said, she said, we're going to do interviews that night, night of your banquet. Just tell me what hotel. I know the date, what time did it start? And I go, hold on. No, you're not going to do interviews that night. And I said, among other things, she said, why? I said, well, among other things, you're not invited. I don't know who you, and she goes, do you know who you're talking to? And I said, yeah. Do you know who you're talking to? And she said, what do you mean by that? I said, I'm the guy with the keys to the door, and you're not invited. She goes, whoa, it sounds like you don't like the news media. And I said, I said, no, it's just that I know the news media. She goes, what do you mean the news? You know the news media. And I said, I spent about 28 years in law enforcement. Do I need to say anything more? And she goes, oh, okay. And I said, hey, listen, this is not designed to be a media event, but, you know, there's some other people that are coming that can handle cameras pretty well. And she goes, really? We're experts with cameras. We are professional people with cameras. I said, well, these people seem to have some pretty good people too. And she said, and who are these people? I said, Lucasfilm. She goes, no way. Lucasfilm's coming to your reunion, but you won't let us come? And I go, yeah, they're going to follow the rules. And so I said, why don't you give Amy at Lucasfilm a call? Maybe she'll share some footage with you. So Amy called me and she goes, that woman was screaming at me. She wasn't happy with you at all. And I go, well, she'll get over it. You know, this is, and she said, Amy said, do you know how big this is? This whole event is? And I go, yeah, this is probably the biggest event in my life. To be able to get these guys together, and nothing's going to get in the way of doing that. Honoring them. And she goes, well, you know who that was you were talking to? And I said, yeah, it was some TV person from Burbank. She said, is that who you thought it was? And I go, yeah. And she goes, no, that was the West Coast producer of the NBC Nightly News. Does that make a difference? I go, no, I don't care who it was. And she said, well, after she calmed down, she agreed to all of your rules, so I told her she could come. Is that okay? And I go, ooh, And I said, well, Amy, and she goes, another thing is, I'd like to monitor NBC so you don't have to worry about it. I go, really? She says, yeah, I got no problem. If they don't follow the rules, we'll just throw them out. And, you know, and I don't know that she meant that more figuratively, but I said, okay, Amy. So the reunion moves, you know, it's all set. That Tom Brokaw video was not for NBC. Tom happens to be a relative of Megan on the other side of the family, and he lived in the Bay Area at the time, and he was helping me move Megan, her distant relative, and he said, you know, I've got a winery. I want to supply all the wine for your whole event. I said, well, thank you. He said, do you have a budget? And I go, no. And he goes, well, I want to help. I really want to help. I said, okay. Thank you very much. And he said, do you think there's any chance I could come? I said, well, Bob, you're kind of family, you know? And he said, I'm not your family, but I would just love to come to this. I said, well, you're supplying the wine. Of course you can come. He goes, oh, thank you. He said, I know I shouldn't ask, but my college roommate is he's really into World War II stuff. And he's written a couple books, and he's really, you know, into this stuff. Do you think I could bring him? And I said, well, Bob, that's getting farther away from family, and he goes, no, I'm sorry I asked. I said, yeah, no, don't be sorry you asked, but I just have to kind of, you know, keep this thing from getting too big. He goes, no, I understand completely. And I said, by the way, if he's written books about World War II, maybe I've heard of his name. And he goes, and he was your roommate? And he goes, yeah, at the University of South Dakota. He said, I'm sure you heard of him. And I said, who is it? And he goes, Tom Brokaw. And I go, well, maybe we'll reconsider here. And so Tom couldn't make it to the reunion, but he did that video thing, that video intro. And all the vets just loved it that night. And Lucasfilm, as we were getting along, and this says more about me than it does about Lucasfilm. I just got so, I don't think I was uptight, but I'm so directed in making sure that things worked, that Amy from Lucasfilm called me and she goes, are you having the food catered for the banquet? And I said, I don't know. She said, do you have a budget for it? And I said, no, but we're going to make it work if we have cold cuts. You know, this is not about the food, it's about them. And we got to do what we got to do, Megan, and Amy, and I said something like, if you really don't like the food, you know, if it bothers you, you know, you don't have to come, but this is more important than the food. She goes, no, don't misunderstand me. We want to take care of the dinner for everybody. I go, really? Then she goes, yeah, we've got an advertising budget for a film coming out. We'd like to use some of that to pay for everybody. And I said, okay. And so, and she said also, how are you going to pay for the red tails to get out here to California if they're not from here? She said, some are from back east. I said, we're trying to raise some money for that. And she said, but you don't have a budget for that either. I said, no. And she said, we want to pay for that too, out of our advertising budget. And she said, another thing you mentioned to me that stuck in my mind is you said this is not a black event or a white event, it's a black and white event. She said, I listened when you said that. And so if there's any of the bomber guys that can't afford to come but would like to, we want to pay their expenses too. So I've got to say that about Lucasfilm, they've really stepped forward. After the banquet was when we showed my documentary, and before we introduced that, that's Zelly Orr, the National Historian for Tuskegee Airmen at the time. The man is a guy by the name of Allie Peake. Allie Peake was a mechanic. When they gave out the Presidential Gold Medal, he's from Detroit. When they gave the Presidential Gold Medal and President Bush gave that to the Tuskegee Airmen, Allie was invited, but he couldn't attend because he taught Sunday school and he couldn't be away from the kids at Sunday school. He was So we convinced him that plane photo of Geraldine was actually his plane. He'd never seen a picture. I had it. I contacted him, and we persuaded him to come to this event but he had to leave on Saturday because he had to be back to teach Sunday school on Sunday. So we presented him with the medal. Zelli did that night, and he just broke down when he got it. These are three of the 485th guys: Jim Scheib, my dad's co-pilot, Art Kane, and Harold Kempfer, and they were just so thrilled to be able to thank the Red Tails. There's some of very seldom at this reunion, and it went on for about 3 or 4 days. Very seldom did you see any of the Red Tails together. They were out mingling because they were as interested in talking to the bomber guys as the bomber guys were interested in talking to them. That's Bob Friend on the top there. This is a group of them together, having a good time. There's Bob Friend. We had our business meeting, and the 45th business, some of the guys would get up and tell stories, and we invited the Red Tails. Had no idea that Bob Friend would have a story that he wanted to tell. And he got up to tell his story, and he could barely get through it without laughing. And everybody, really enjoyed the fact that he felt so at home. He also attended other reunions after that. We kind of adopted him, and he made every effort to be with us.
You were forced to land in Ramitelli. Jim, what was it like landing at that base?
I think the majority of us were really surprised when they found so many black faces.
Jim Scheib and
the word got around real fast. The entire base was black.
I don't think that they realized that the Red Tail fighters were flown by black pilots, and that they were supported by black personnel, and they were surprised, very pleasantly so, I think.
I do remember, though, talking to black pilots, and at first we were a little bit uneasy, we're feeling each other out. Pretty soon we were just pilots talking, and it was a wonderful common ground. That's when we began to learn, well, there's no difference here.
How do you think it changed your attitude, the attitudes of the guys around you?
When we got back to our home base, I wrote a letter to my mother. I said, "Dear Mom, we flew a mission to northern Italy, and when we returned, our field was closed due to weather. We landed in the P-51 fighter field and couldn't get off for 5 days. All of the pilots and ground crews were Negroes. They treated us like kings. I feel very privileged that it snowed on our field that day in 1944, because if it hadn't been for that, today perhaps I would have carried on whatever feelings I had to my parents. That event set me on course for the rest of my life. My influence on my family about segregation, the whole lack of civil rights in the country.
I think it was good for posterity, good for the Air Force, and good for the civil rights movement, and I guess from all standpoints it was a positive experience.
That's them saying, what kind of the message I had. But I just feel so lucky that I was able to bring part of the story forward. And NBC Nightly News, that clip was from an outtake from the NBC Nightly News story that night. And we don't often celebrate when things go right, if it's at a time when things normally aren't going right. And I spoke to one of the people from the Tuskegee Airmen group, a younger person, and I said, you know, I was a little disappointed that the story really didn't get more attention. I mean, because it's so positive. It really is. And what she told me, she goes, well, I agree, but she said, that wasn't the norm. And I said, isn't it just as important if it's the exception? Isn't it maybe more worthy of being celebrated if it's the exception and still happens? She said, I agree with you. So, you know, people can have different you know, views and opinions, but I believe it was truly a wonderful experience, and I've spoken to probably 30 or 40 children of the airmen who were there, and their lives were impacted in much the same way as mine has been by my dad when they heard the story being passed on from their fathers. So overall, it was a wonderful experience. Any final questions or anything? I'll be hanging around here if you have other questions or comments you want to make, but if there's anything you want to ask me, go ahead.
Yeah, let me come around with the microphone in just a second, if we would. And before we take the questions, I just wanted to let you know, Jerry, Karen Crumlich, you got John Bertram among a host of people, as well as Candy Miles is watching at home, and she says she was at the reunion in San Diego, and both of them wanted to say hello to you. So how about a hand for our speaker today, folks?